on what you've said there, like in terms of it takes longer to learn to go into the skills and the intricacies of delivering those things. What's your sense of what can go wrong when you apply them too early? Because I know people do read loosely around it and they kind of go, I've heard of this phrase, I kind of have a sense of what the individual words mean, and now I'm sort of doing it with my client because I read an article about it.
Oh, okay.
Can that stuff go wrong?
Maybe so if you haven't read enough and got a sort of a vast sort of knowledge base about all the other areas of it. So I think, individual pieces of, let's say, techniques or strategies are useful. But often when you're learning about the whole model, you understand more about the context which it can be applied to best as well. But no, I wouldn't say so. I'd say that's very skill dependent. Some things are a bit more complex, which require depth of knowledge, maybe knowing the philosophy behind it, maybe teeing it up by, let's say, working on other areas, and then that works best. So let's say, working on cognitions to then put in a behavioral kind of strategy. But no, it's very contextual, really. That's the only best way I can answer that, really. But I just think overall, I think learning about, the variety of different sort of cognitive behavioral approaches, obviously there's one core one, but things like ACT, and obviously REBT and CT, I'm really just sort of looking at it quite pluralistically, and thinking what skills could work in various different areas, having sort of a large repertoire of when to draw out those skills and how they can resonate with different kind of clientele, because everyone's very different, and I think it's very important to be very idiosyncratic in your approach, and know which things to draw on at certain times or with certain clients. So yeah,
because I think on that point, I think there's a whole spectrum across personal trainers in terms of taking a more of a psychological approach or looking at psychology as a coaching tool. You've got obviously people on either end of the spectrum where there are people who are branding themselves specifically as holistic coaches, life coaches, and actually advertising that they are working on client psychology as a service, but perhaps not having a formal qualification in that, and their qualification being personal trainer. And then you've got people who are perhaps on the other end of the spectrum, maybe very intuitively skilled, working with people, terrified to acknowledge psychology as something they should be getting involved with, because they are not qualified, and therefore maybe leaving opportunities to help people probably out, even though they'd probably be very capable of doing it. Like, how do you kind of, I guess what's
very interesting. Yeah, but
approach,
it's very, very interesting, and there's not really a right answer to that. We even have it within our field. So, psychology is a broad, let's say, career path, and there's various different psychological professions with it: clinical psychologists, sports psychologists, child psychologists, organizational psychologists, and within each one of those, even though there's certain underpinnings, obviously, your degree, your masters, etc. But thereafter that, your competency is based on your own professional training which you had. So there'll be certain things that you'd have to go to different psychologists about. So we even have that within our own field, and competencies, and should you be doing this, should you be doing that, etc. So I definitely understand where there's people on the other side of the spectrum a bit scared to even approach anything psychological. But at the same time, psychology is so important in absolutely everything. I think it'd be very hard for them not to, and even if they're not acknowledging it, they are in some way. And I think I think the best thing to do is really, to skill yourself up and to learn various things about it, because I personally believe, and this is just my my personal philosophy that yes, a comprehensive approach is important to understand things like nutrition. To obviously, yes, if you're a PT, that's your main area and that's where your strength is, but certainly to take into account psychology. I think the line where it sort of draws is where it's sort of trying to attenuate, let's say, mental health problems. So let's say, you know, a client comes to yourself and, you know, they have major depression or extreme anxiety. And rather than trying to increase their ability to engage in physical activity, which will be sort of an indirect of attenuating that, going straight to their psychology and working with them in terms of their cognitions, etc. So that, I think that's the clear delineation. And I think I can't imagine many personal trainers going for that approach first. Maybe there's some out there because there's obviously people out there who engage in various things. But no, I don't think there's nothing wrong with sort of working with understanding certain principles, applying certain things, maybe CBT strategies, and especially when it's in a domain where it's to, let's say, foster more positive psychology. So not taking someone from a deficit where, you know, they're trying to get back to normality and impaired function, but you're trying to improve someone. I don't think there's much sort of problem there because there's less ethical dilemma in respect to that. You know, that you're not trying to attenuate and bring us back to functionality. You're making someone thrive. You're helping them get to a level which allows them to flourish in their lives. So in terms of my perspective, I think there's nothing wrong with understanding that. And I think that the main thing is, you know, what can we do best to support this individual and to reach them, to get from their discrepancy from who they currently are and how they're currently behaving to this individual which they want to be.
Because I mean, it might be probably worth just dipping into your background and your training a little bit, and just sort of how you got into where you are now and what you kind of learned along the way, and obviously your qualifications that have come along with that as well.
Yeah, it's a long story, but it's obviously got many years as well. But okay, so so start from sort of secondary school. I went to an all-boys school. It was a sports college as well, so I've always been into sports. I used to play football. I played to a sort of point where I played for the city, at sort of a youth age. Stopped playing football due to sort of injuries, and then obviously just really got sort of passionate into sort of academia. I was always relatively sort of academic, but once the sport had gone, I really sort of vested in academia. Through my A-levels, became really passionate about psychology. I just thought it was fascinating understanding the psychology of people, why we behave, why we think in different ways, why some people have challenges in situations, why others don't. And then with that information, how could we support individuals to, as I said, sort of fulfill their life or have less disturbance in their day-to-day interactions. So that led me to, obviously, I did my A-level, then I went and did my undergraduate degree as well in psychology, which was excellent. At that particular point, I'd always, and I think everyone who gets into a psychology degree probably thinks, I want to be a clinical psychologist and work with people. And that cliche sort of on a couch and, you know, someone's come to see you and you're trying to support them in that way. But during my psychology degree, even though I felt it was excellent, I really, really enjoyed it. I felt like I needed a bit of time away as well. So I had a couple of years off where I just literally just worked in, I was working in sort of sales roles, nothing related to psychology at all. And then obviously because I am quite passionate about psychology and academia, then yeah, that hunger sort of develops again. And it was during those 2 years where I started discovering, I got really into fitness myself, and I started discovering, you know, the psychological benefits of physical activity. And I became really interested in that, and that led me to sport and exercise psychology as a particular field of specialism. So then did my master's in that, and that really opened up my eyes, and that was kind of combining two things. So my passion in psychology and also my hobby in physical activity, sports, etc. So it was the synergy of the two was really fit for me and my history so far. Got really into that, finished my master's. Oh, sorry, I'll go back a little bit. During my master's, I was very fortunate to have a fantastic supervisor a guy called Dr. Martin Turner, who is quite sort of prominent in sport and exercise psychology. And he introduced me to a CBT approach called REBT, which is one of the sort of earliest forms of CBT. And it was there where I became to really sort of develop a philosophy around that, about the importance of our cognitions in respect to our emotions and our behaviors. And when I did training for that, which supported my master's thesis. And I, at the time, was really interested in exercise addiction. So a very under-recognized area of research. And I conducted, in terms of publication, because I know other ones out there, the first intervention on exercise addiction, which was fantastic. It got published, and then thereafter that, I was like, okay, this is really interesting. But what are sort of the core reasons why people will get sort of addicted to exercise? And often it sort of originates from appearance or body image. And that then led me on to do my PhD, which I'm coming towards the end of now. And that's looking at basically CBT, or cognitions precisely in relation to body image. And since that, I've done my training as a chartered psychologist also as well. So that's along to the side of that, and worked with...
Just
yeah, worked alongside various individuals in sporting milieux, and also one-to-one. So just a lot of behavioural change, really, looking at applying psychological interventions to change people's physical activity behaviour, or their sort of dietary behaviour. And then let's just make sure I'm getting everything wrapped up. Also as well, obviously I recently moved to London, so it's coming up a year now actually. And I started my role in sort of neuropsychology as well. So that really sort of gave me an additional sort of advance in looking at sort of the neuroscience. I've always been sort of interested in that anyway. But obviously working with it in my career, it's kind of at the forefront as well. So it just allows me to look at things on multiple layers, you know, the brain itself as the organism, the cognitions within that, and then the outcomes of that being our behaviors and our emotions, etc. So it's a fascinating sort of model. And also, sorry, I did my personal training qualification as well about 1.5 years ago, because just like see ourselves, you know, we're very interested in this holistic view of individuals. You know, nutrition's important, engaging physics is important, so psychology around that, and each one of them really sort of interacts within each other. So I'm always of that sort of a viewpoint and advocating that viewpoint. I'll stop now.
It's a good list, isn't it? It's a good list. I'm interested to, you mentioned there some applied parts of psychology into approaches, yes. And also I'm sure along the way as well, some theoretical understanding of how those practical solutions have arisen, and what the research states and what the literature states. Like I feel like it's probably the same for physical activity, personal training, kind of physical disciplines as it is for psychology. But to what extent have you found either of those useful? Do they complement each other? Do you think you've met people who are theoretically very, very savvy and knowledgeable, but not great psychologists in practice, and vice versa? People very good at working with individuals, but don't have the, you know, a huge amount of theoretical knowledge?
That's a great question. It's a very, very good question. Because obviously practice is normally driven by theory. Everything that everything that I'd have to do as, you know, as a registered psychologist has to be evidence-based. So the theory is pertinent, and that's what the whole of your education or your career would be up until when you start training as a psychologist. So you're absorbing all this theory, and then it's like, okay, here's the practical skills that you need to learn now, and this is more sort of psychotherapeutic models, communication, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, I think everyone, you know, some people may have innate ability to, you know, elicit conversations out of people or to develop rapport easier. But I think everything can be taught, and that's the sort of things that each psychologist has to be taught and has to go through rigorous sort of competence-based things to display that they're able to do that. And therefore, I think, you know, those skills can be transferable. But yeah, absolutely. Off the offset, I think there'll be definitely individuals who are naturally more predisposed to be better at the practitioner side stuff. But I think everyone kind of gets there once they're constantly sort of training themselves.
Yeah, and as someone who's been through extensive, I guess, academic experiences with psychology and also sports psychology in mind, and also you've been through the qualification that's required to be a personal trainer. Is there a significant difference between, obviously, the time alone that you've spent training to do one versus the other is quite significant. I don't know how long your level 3 personal training qualification took, but I know they don't, they do vary a little bit. Do you think, is that something that if that was swapped around, it would worry you if people were going in to work with, as you mentioned, like people in the clinical psychologist setting who have, issues that that are affecting daily function and need to get back to that normal level before you can even worry about optimization? With the level of training you've seen for the level 3, would that worry you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because it is a very, very long procedure. It takes up to, between 8 and 10 years, essentially. And a lot of time. And within that as well, there's a lot of maturation in yourself as well, which only can occur from experience and time. So absolutely. And I can see myself as even in the infancy of my career with many, many years of development. I've got a lot more to develop on and learning. So, and I'm aware of that. So definitely, if you haven't even been through any of that, then yes. But as I say, I'd hope, and this may be very optimistic, that someone would be aware of that when doing so. But at the same time, there is a lot of individuals who are working with issues which probably they shouldn't be.
Yeah, because I think, we're sort of, you mentioned already the different disciplines within psychology.
Yeah.
While there are different disciplines, of course, within physical activity, within personal training themselves, you are acting as a generalist. So people will come in with goals that require you to have understanding of, as we've already touched on, nutrition, training, but also, it helps if you know something about psychology. And we've already talked about people who are perhaps innately somewhat more gifted in eliciting conversation with people. That helps as well, because it is obviously personal training as opposed to sort of impersonal training, which sometimes it can come out as. Do you think from your level 3, did you come out that feeling sort of well covered from those angles? Would you work?
No, definitely not. I think the same thing applies again with just like a psychologist. You come out with a base level, a rudimentary foundation level, and I think it's a ongoing development throughout your career. There's so much you can learn because, I have a basis of knowledge, but I know there's so much more knowledge also with the various different areas, and that's because it's just as vast. It's a physical domain. So yeah, it's I think people need to be skilling up in a lot of different areas, and this is why there is those niches or areas where people specialize in, because it's that vast. I don't know if it's feasible for everyone to know a lot about all of those areas. That is.
So with that in mind, because I completely agree. I think also obviously why we created the 6-9 education and the app is something that's kind of at the heart of the culture of our business, and I know yours as well. In terms of personal trainers upskilling, and let's just align this with what you've done on your thesis. Obviously, body image for personal trainers is something they face. They're on the front line of all the time. I have gained more understanding of that from a few conversations with yourself than I have from any formalized training as a personal trainer with regards to body image. What do you think are some of the key things that you would sort of try to get across to personal trainers, or maybe dispelling? There's a few myths out there in terms of people's body image and people who maybe haven't achieved good body composition results, and there are assumptions about their attitudes and behaviors which may be incorrect, cause a lot of issues.
Okay, well the question there's multiple sort of angles, but first of all, I think body image, and this is again my personal philosophy, I think body image should precede physical change, because body image relates to how you think, feel, and behave in regards to your physical appearance. Now, often, people try to, let's say, tackle or circumvent problems about how they think about themselves with changing their physical appearance. But often they get to that physical goal, that new aesthetic ideal. And if the sort of cognitions or the way they're thinking hasn't changed, they will still lay dormant. And all it requires and all it really does is reinforce this sort of feeling, this ideology, let's say, that I can only accept myself when I look like this. Which realistically you want is, I can accept myself regardless, but this is an ideal which I want to strive towards, which is nothing wrong with that at all. I think it's from, I don't think anyone could really say realistically that, they may not care about their appearance. You wouldn't want so. And that's not even a part of body image. Part of body image, positive body image, that is, as a separate construct, is to take care of one's appearance, to eat nutritious food, to exercise regularly, to engage in self-care practices. But as long as that you can detach your worth away from your physical appearance being something, then that puts you in a better position. Because if not, you're going to be chasing this never-ending goal. And that experience, that journey up and leading to that is going to be very problematic, a lot of emotional disturbance, more likelihood of maladaptive practices being excessively rigid or maybe disordered, or even further eating disordered behavior or exercise addiction, or, which we definitely don't want as well, is complete exercise avoidance. I feel that unhappy about my appearance that I don't want to go anywhere near a gym or exercise because I don't look like someone who should exercise. So either of those spectrums, being relating to exercise or diet, is problematic. So I personally think that body image should come hand in hand with sort of engaging physical activity. And certain things, obviously, which will foster that in terms of when you're working with an individual is the language used around appearance. So maybe anytime someone sort of mentions, let's say, when they're exercising, it's all to do with the appearance, or I'm doing this to burn this rather than doing this to enjoy this. Again, just sort of maybe ushering them to a place which is not just about the appearance. It's about what the body can do. It's about how exercise makes you feel. It's about how it aligns to your values, and then how that cascades down into those values. So that's one area I'd certainly go with.
That's one area. I love it.
There's a lot of things there. Sorry.
I think just obviously it's a vast topic, and when talking to someone like yourself who's studied it for a long time, you get a huge amount of value in a very short space of time, because there's a lot to be said about it. I wonder if I can take it in an interesting direction. There are kind of movements, I guess, or groups of people who are kind of rebelling slightly against this idea that you should, fit into a particular ideal in terms of body image, and therefore you should be on a diet. There's a sort of rage against diet culture, is like a term that seems to have propped up, and this idea of also that body positivity, just kind of healthy, it crosses over with this kind of healthy at every size type approach as well. And I think there's probably an equal amount of density packed into each one of those questions. But what do you kind of make of some of those angles? Because I think from a balance point of view, I always like to sit on the intellectual fence before I know what I'm dealing with, and I don't know maybe enough about those topics. So I kind of say, well, I would imagine there'll be some positives and negatives to all of those.
Absolutely. And that's such a great question, Russ, because this is a really salient topic at the moment, with the, against diet culture and healthy at every size and body positivity. They all sit at that one side of the spectrum. And you've got obviously, let's say, medics, sort of a medical view of this, obesity, it's not good for our health, it's not good for this, psychological, etc. And they're either ends of that. And essentially, I personally I'd say somewhere in the middle of that, more leaning towards a medical model, because the problem that the body positivity and the war against diet culture have is they believe that weight stigma is a real problem. So that individuals who are larger bodies or bodies which aren't conceived as the ideals, the cultural set ideals that is, get treated differently. They're not able to engage in physical activity and a variety of things. And I believe that comes from a very good space. And I think that weight stigma is something that should be attenuated and squashed. So, and obviously it's a hard thing because obviously it's quite, let's say, it's inherent in our genes because we sort of, through culture for our whole lives, what we've been observed to, we may have certain biases towards, larger bodies or smaller bodies, etc. But I think that we can work collectively to identify when we may have these biases and then maybe try and change them. And in particular, as we work with individuals in a sort of a health space to notice if we're labeling certain things or attributing certain things to someone's weight and treating them different than someone who is of a, let's say, an average body shape. So I completely get that. But at the same time, there is nowhere near enough evidence to not go with diets or to say that obesity is not a problem at all, because it very much is so. And it's something that needs to be tackled. So I believe take the element of the weight stigma to help people feel comfortable, to understand that all bodies are accepted, that all bodies are different and no one has to hit any kind of ideal, whilst also taking into account that even if obviously you don't need to reach your ideal, there are certain levels of health which are beneficial for you. And at the moment, it's determined by things like the BMI, which isn't the most robust measurement, but at the same time, it gives us an indicator. And we can't ignore that because there is evidence to suggest that. And as long as you're in whatever your healthy weight and you're functioning adequately and you're able to still have quality of life rather than sort of being stubborn to all diets are bad, all this is bad, all that's bad, then that's all that matters really. So yeah, I hope that sort of answered your question, but somewhere really in the middle. And back to one of your questions as well, there was certainly not enough evidence to suggest so, because a lot of their main postulates is that diets never work. And yeah, people do struggle with diets, but it's about finding sophisticated evidence-based methods to help them adhere to that. It's not saying never go on one and therefore neglect eating healthy or neglect trying to modulate your weight to a healthier place, that's when I think they go too far down that sort of spectrum.
Very interesting stuff, isn't it? Very, very interesting. It's good. It's nice to kind of hear your opinion on it, because I think it's so emotionally charged often that there's quite a sometimes the forums in which those discussions happen are quite poor forums. So you end up with the two divergent ends of the spectrum having a go at each other, who are at least two people likely to agree and concede any ground on what they hold so dear as a sort of personal value. There's this kind of war plays out on social media sometimes. So I think it's good to hear a more balanced, objective view, which probably reflects reality a little bit more. Do you think so? I think sometimes what I've seen is there is an assumption about the way that people think on one end of the spectrum, made by people perceived to be at the other end of the spectrum. However, where do you sit on, everybody's got a very similar nervous system, very similar brain function. There are unifying characteristics that span the entire spectrum. And I always find that really two humans sort of looking at each other and convincing themselves that they are completely different species almost, and they couldn't possibly ever reconcile viewpoints, to be a little bit perhaps existing in a bubble, an echo chamber within their own sort of subcultures. Is there as much avoidance behavior, tactical kind of play on either end of that continuum? People who are always in fitness and people who is there as much reluctance to stop exercising and eat more and gain weight here as there is reluctance to involve themselves in diet culture and lose weight here?
Oh, I think that'd be a very, very hard question to answer, really, without going and interviewing a million people with each camps. But it's really, really hard to sort of say, to be fair, because, the body positive movement, intuitive eating, which kind of falls into it as well, they're very new. They're quite novel. So they're developing. And initially when they first started, there was a lot of sort of, you know, advocacy for them. A lot of people resonated with that. And of course, people who have struggled with diets or with physical activity, or felt that they didn't relate to others because, you know, there was this sort of external, let's say, society, this sort of non-tangible thing which is telling you, you need to look this way, you need to be this way, etc. And they found that really overwhelming to the point where it put them off engaging in these activities. So yeah, if let's say, for example, I find a way of rejecting this culture, which for me personally allows me to engage in physical activity, not think about societal ideals, and eat nutritious food to a moderate level, then yes, it probably would have beneficial sort of impacts to me. So I don't know if I'm going a bit off on a tangent, but I think it really relates to the individual. But overall, I think it just needs to go down to, yes, you're completely right. We have very similar biological makeup. But there are even slight nuances within that. I'm not sure if you're aware of a guy called Giles Yeo, who's a geneticist, and he does a lot of research on genes which moderate our ability to tolerate hunger or notice hunger. And there's these certain individuals who have these genes which make saying no to certain foods or food in general harder than another person. So even little things like that are quite interesting. That there are slight nuances which need to take on board. But overall, I just think that working, and this, I'm going to be biased because it's a psychological sort of stance, working on individuals' ability to, let's say, validate themselves, to derive self-worth from themselves, to have skills to ensure that they get to their own ideal. That's not a permeative, pervasive societal ideal. That's really the goal. That's really the goal where I think everyone should be. Forget about either side here, either side here. It's about what is my ideal, which is still in line with health, which evidence suggests, which is a medical model, but also just validating myself, giving myself self-worth without, let's say, things of like appearance or accolades, etc.
Yeah.
But I may have went off on a tangent there.
It doesn't seem to matter if I throw you a bad question, you still manage to throw back a good answer. This is great. You're getting me out of all sorts of problems here. So I'm interested. Let's stick with body image, because I know I know it's something you've covered in great detail. And it's going to be of massive value to the people kind of listening in and watching. It's interesting how attached we become to particular body ideals, given that they shift quite significantly over time. Absolutely. The expectation perhaps being, or the outliers, if you like, perhaps setting the expectation, you know, Arnie comes along and changes people's ideals about what male physique could be, even if not, you know, readily accepted by the general population to begin with. It certainly had an impact. What are your sort of thoughts on how things change and how we kind of deal with that?
Absolutely. So it's a really good sort of thing that you highlighted there in terms of the shift of the ideals. Even when I'm sort of, educating like lectures and stuff about body image, one of the areas which I look into or to illustrate is the constant shifts of this, you know, for men and women actually, but body image issues have been more salient for women for longer periods of time. But, you know, it goes from sort of Marilyn Monroe to Twiggy to Kim Kardashian to Kate Moss to etc. And it's constantly changing. Each decade there is a new kind of ideal, which is even more reason why people should be turning inwards and challenging what's going on inwards rather than looking outside to what I should look like. So yeah, you're very, very right there. Even just with males as well, as you said with Arnie. Arnie was one of those critical moments in sort of the 90s. And this is what you can look like. Then it went down to sort of more leaner, Brad Pitt, Fight Club basis, then sort of a Zac Efron, lean, you know, it's ever changing. And this is what culture is. Culture is about popular things. And not everyone can fit that. We're all, you know, how many billion, sorry, as it are, we can't fit that. So it's about finding your ideal, which makes you happy, but it doesn't make you happy because you feel you fitting with a societal ideal, which is arbitrary. It's because this physically feels good for me, and I'm able to do certain things, and that's pretty much where it should end up.
Mm. Yeah, so I remember hearing a kind of analogy that was used similar to that. I think I'm not going to be able to get it bang on, but I don't think I need to. But it was basically there was an Air Force was sort of designing pilot seats in fighter planes, and they opted to try and determine what the average fighter pilot size, shape, dimensions were, and then match the seats to those. And of course, nobody fitted the damn thing because nobody was average. Yeah. So it was a complete disaster, and they had to revert to the more expensive way of customizing all of the chairs accordingly to size, because so crucial. And you know, there was so much at stake, obviously, in those situations. So I just think something similar happens sometimes with physique. People look at somebody else's genetic makeup and their experiences and what that's culminated in right now, even if they're different age, different gender, different, you know, it just doesn't seem to matter. Absolutely. And then trying to make their body into that one.
Absolutely. And that's a fantastic analogy. I haven't heard that one, but that is fantastic. Yeah, it's almost like, you know, society's the chair, and individuals invest in that they have to fit in that, regardless of their biological makeup, their composition of their body. It's a great analogy. But realistically, life isn't like that. Life is complex, and we have to take the more difficult route, maybe. Well, it's not difficult in terms of psychological, but a route which we may not have thought was inherent in, you know, creating your own chair, tailoring your own life and tailoring your own physique. Yeah.
And I'm just interested. I think I'm going to begin to stop asking you, peppering you with.
I don't mind. I enjoy them.
I'm getting a lot for myself. So selfishly, I'm going to carry on. But in terms of, you mentioned earlier, there's this kind of continuum with regards to the perhaps the body positivity, where you've got this kind of, maybe anecdotal, personal views over here, and you've got the medical research-led areas over here. And we talked about it with regards to practice as well earlier on. You know, you've got this kind of, what does the research say, and then in practice, what are people doing? So there's this idea perhaps that we've got two ends of that spectrum. With regards to body positivity, I know the answer comes back on an individual basis. It should be what suits that person, and we work with the person. And then from a general point of view, maybe there's a bit more general guidelines for everybody, which have to be by nature more of a grey area and less black and white. How does that square with what the literature states? It almost feels like the scientific community on this angle would say that if we could look at each individual, we could actually determine what the optimum weight, muscle mass, exercise frequency. You know, there are companies out there at the moment advertising, and I'm not 100% sure of the efficacy of their approach, but we'll look at your DNA and we'll determine what foods you should be eating. Yeah. And these two things don't seem to marry up. Do you have a sense of how that?
Yeah, so I'll try and offer an explanation to the best of my ability. But it's funny that you said about, you know, companies who look at this DNA and all that sort of stuff. And that person I told you about, that Jazz Yo individual, that geneticist at Cambridge University, he alluded to some of those individuals who claim that. And now I think the best way to delineate between these two sides is evidence-based research and literature, not just claiming to come from scientific backgrounds. Because anyone could really say, yes, I've just conducted one little sort of research project, and I found this with, you know, a cohort of 100, and therefore, you know, this sort of works, etc. Whereas sort of evidence-based, looking at it in sort of a tier, you know, randomized controlled trials, etc., being, you know, the gold standard, I think that's where we really need to be looking at, building upon. And body positivity, as far as I'm aware, there's not really much research because of its infancy. But I believe certain, because it's a movement, it's not really a psychological construct, so it's very hard to even measure that. There's so many different constructs within that. And a lot of constructs that are within that align to positive body image. So we'll find favorable things within it. But overall, as an ideology that someone holds, yeah, there'd have to be a lot more sort of rigorous testing in regards to it. And it's very, very hard. You'd have to get a sort of match panel saying this construct is it, that construct's in it, that construct's in it, and find some kind of consensus, which I don't even believe that they are aware of that as of yet, to be honest, because it's evolving also as well. You know, last year, you know, intuitive eating, massive part of it. And intuitive eating's already started to change what intuitive eating is, because now it's kind of dying down, this kind of reject all diets, eat whatever, you know, this and that. It's coming back to sort of a middle ground, which is a fantastic place for individuals like myself. I believe that there can be a middle sort of ground. So it's always evolving as well. So this is why it probably makes more sense to stay with the medical, you know, 10, 30 years of evidence. But again, it's dependent on practitioner philosophy.
I think it was Ricky Gervais who actually said, although he may have borrowed it from someone else, but he said that the reason he likes the sort of scientific angle, because if you were to destroy all of the scientific books and all of the religious opinion-based books about history, the ones that would come back exactly the same would be the science ones, and the ones that would come back completely different would be the religious. Yeah, I
haven't heard that, but that is great. I'm going to use that.
I'm sure it's not I quite like it, and I think that the fads probably sit over here, don't they? The fads will be changing and dynamic, whereas some of the sciences. I think I don't know where these quotes are coming from, but I'm peppering you with them. But
great.
You know, this idea, Jeff Bezos was saying, the idea is you can't build a strategy around what changes. You can only build around a strategy around what stays the same, what does not change, and that's what you can build long-term success on. And I think that's poignant both within business when he was talking about it, but also with regards to this sort of stuff as well. The research provides an anchor that will stay stationary for long enough for you to be able to kind of build stuff around it. I certainly know with nutritional approaches with clients, you know, things like energy balance, metabolic pathways, different fuel sources, and those kind of things allow me to give advice that I know will stand true from one client to the next.
Absolutely.
The method of application might change, the conversational style I might adapt to suit my individual client, for instance. So just to begin to my kind of last question really, and this is just me indulging myself, and then I'll let you kind of wrap up with any final thoughts, but just to indulge myself, I look at you know, I do like to look at personal training as a holistic practice. I do look at neurology and psychology, and as well as much as physiology and some of the other sciences to draw together an accurate picture of reality for clients, myself, to be able to understand the things that don't change. I also look at philosophy and schools of thought as well, because I think they can be an interesting way of approaching my coaching philosophy. And there is debate around willpower as a topic. You know, there are schools of thought that say that willpower is not an entity that can be pinned down. It's not something somebody has control over. You mentioned earlier the genetic component in hunger, you know, satiation and things like that. We're starting to understand more about those things. People who are not able to easily adopt behavior change can be accused in the fitness industry of being lazy, lacking willpower. If you believe you can achieve, if you want it enough, you can get it. The American dream, that school of philosophy is packed into an enormous amount of motivational material within the fitness industry. Do you have a kind of take on motivation, particularly when it comes to changing body image or at least like physical appearance? Is there a particular line that you would adopt with regards to clients, and do you use it as a tool or?
Absolutely. Motivation, yes. Willpower, not so much, because there hasn't been enough rigorous sort of testing in it as a construct. But motivation, absolutely. It's you know, probably recall I posted an article relating to that, and I think most robust and I say contemporary motivation model at the moment is the self-determination theory, and I think it's very important. It considers us as sort of humans as being, let's say, naturally predisposed to growth. You know, we naturally predisposed that we want to reach growth, we want to get to self-actualization, etc. But then we're inhibited by our environment. So it's, you know, it's social, sort of psychological. It takes into account what's going on around us, and there's these various different conditions which can prevent us from getting to what we want, or getting our needs, let's say, or things that can satisfy that. And I think it's really important when considering why certain people aren't doing things. And I would, obviously there's cognitions also as well, but I think cognitions feed into the basic psychological needs also as well. So I'd say the reason why someone isn't really engaging in something, yes, there's various things, but it's this ambivalence to change. Maybe because of things like, you know, values aren't considered, or because cognitions, there's certain unhelpful cognitions that the person's had that they've developed from unhelpful experiences, which they've held on for long periods of time, reinforced them day in, day out. So they're very, very, let's say, prominent in the neural pathway. They're easy to access and easy to execute. And it's helping someone to identify those, align them to really, you know, drawing back to what do I even want? You know, why am I doing this? And sort of escorting them to this sort of pathway. And so I think very much motivation and motivation for instance of self-determination are very, very important as a foundation, to then create behavioral change. And I think first point you definitely sort of looking at are certain needs satisfied? What's the regulation that this person's deriving to conducting behavior? Is it introjected, so they're doing it to fit in with society or to avoid guilt or anxiety? If so, that's probably a key reason as to why this behavior isn't staying prominent, or they're not adhering to it. Whereas you want to be moving them, or we want to be moving them towards sort of intrinsic, or let's say at least identified and integrated. So they understand that, okay, this isn't completely intrinsic. I'm not doing it just for enjoyment, but it means something to me. And I identify that this is a valuable commodity in my life, and therefore I'm going to do it more. And, you know, naturally it could progress to integrated or to intrinsic. So it's definitely an important thing. And the good thing about it is there's literature to support that. And there's mechanisms which individuals can use, how practitioners like ourselves can use to escort people that way. One particular really good one is there's a lot of sort of integration between MI skills, so motivation and interview skills, which you're probably aware of, and cognitive behavioral, and how the two marry up very well to foster psychological change, develop good rapport, align people with their values, and provide them with cognitive and behavioral strategies to circumvent challenge.
Very well put.
I hope.
Very well.
That helps.
Very well put. Yeah, no, I just find that sort of thing fascinating. I think from understanding can come empathy. I think if you
Absolutely.
understand that there are more complicated things at play than just somebody's desire to do something, automatically resulting in their behaviour doing it, I think it allows you to take a step back as a coach. And I think at that point you are, as we talked about at the beginning, to bring it full circle, I think you are using the theory to improve your practice, and ultimately to make you a sort of more complete coach, trainer, psychologist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. We will draw it to a close there. I would love to carry on. I think I could carry on at night, to be honest. But next time I'll let you prepare more in advance so that I can ask you questions. And thank you very much for that, mate. I really appreciate you coming on and having a chat. I know that people are going to find this so useful. Hopefully there are going to be loads of questions from other people, not just me now. And I know that we're going to be doing another one of these at some point. Happy to. About different topics. But yeah, for now, thank you very much, mate.
No problem at all. Good speaking to you. I thoroughly enjoyed it.